I reached out to the FAA, and today we have a special treat. We actually have an interview with the FAA discussing specifically the flights over people. So let's do it. Hey guys, thanks for stopping by. Always appreciate it. It's good to see you. So if this is your first time here, my name is Keith and this is Alien Drones. I do mostly drone tech, photography, tips and tutorials, and industry news. If that's something that's of interest to you, you may want to hit that subscribe button now. That'll let you know when there's new content that might be of interest to you. As I mentioned in the intro, when I did the review for the remote ID and the flights at night, I said I would follow up with a flights over people. In case you're new to the industry or somehow missed the reviews that I did on the remote ID and the flights at night, I will put those links up here, so you want to take the time and go view those as well, because that's going to be an integral part of what this rule was about. I don't know how you could have missed them. How is it possible they could have missed them? So one of the things that I like to do on this channel is when there's new rules or FAA regulations, I like to go through them and try to clear them up, try to make it so it's easy to understand. And one of the ways I do that is I talk directly to the FAA and get their opinion on it, because sometimes there's nuances or just things are just plain confusing, and I don't want to interpret it wrong. I want to get information straight from the source. That's just how I roll. So today's video will be longer than normal, much longer than anything you typically see on this channel. However, there's such great relevant information, I didn't want to shortchange you by trying to chop out relevant information just so I could make the video shorter. So my suggestion would be, if you don't have time to watch it all the way through right now, that's okay. Go ahead and put it in your watch later folder so you can come back to it and pick up from where you left off. I will put some bookmarks in to show the relevant sections, so hopefully that'll make it easier. So I'm going to get right into it. So today on Alien Drones, we are very fortunate to have Kevin Morris from the FAA's Communication Center. Kevin comes to us as a digital communications strategist and an unmanned aircraft systems coordinator. Whew, that's a mouthful. I get that right, Kevin?
That sounds pretty exciting, Keith. I'll take all those descriptions.
Indeed, that's quite a lengthy one. There's got to be some kind of good acronym or something we can put with that. I don't know, but that's pretty impressive indeed. So as I mentioned, we're going to run down the flights over people. And Kevin, from what I understand, this rule is a result of the NPRM that came out in 2019. And it was introduced anyway, and then the remote ID came out last year. It was part of it. So can you tell us why this was introduced in the first place? Was there a need for it, or were you getting a lot of questions on it? And couldn't we always just fly over people, with UAVs, or was that not allowed anytime?
Yeah, so a great question to start, and I just wanted to throw a thanks your way for having me on. It's really exciting to talk to people who are not only engaged in the community, but who are out there actually doing the work, whether it's FPV flying or commercially or just for fun. So this is really exciting for me. I always enjoy these conversations. So to your question, the ops over people rule is really the result of the evolution of drones in the United States. It's Part 107, when we published that rule, it seems like forever ago now. It was the first step in a series of steps towards fully integrating drones into our national airspace system. And I think that's probably something I would really want your listeners to take away from this conversation, is that the FAA's goal has always been to integrate. There's never been a goal to segregate or carve out or move things away or relegate you to, it's always been, how do we move forward at a pace that supports innovation while making sure we still maintain the safest aerospace system in the world. The ops over people rule, although it's a bit of a misnomer, I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but the ops over people rule is that next step in that process. So it is the next step to integrating drones. And what we did is we looked at the operations that had been going on with regards to, and here's where it's a little bit of a misnomer, because as you know, ops over people rule also included, probably more exciting for most people, night. So that was another big part of the rule. So when we looked at the waiver requests we were getting, by far, the most often requested waiver was a waiver to the daylight only rule. That it wasn't even close, right? The next one down the list was ops over people. So we took a look at those rules. We took a look at what had been going on. We took a look at the data we were getting and decided we can now take a step towards normalizing sustained ops over people flying and flying at night, whereas you don't have to go through the waiver process anymore. It's just part of the rule. So that's why the rule came about, specifically for ops over people in the night portion. It was the next logical step. And from the feedback I've been hearing, most people are pretty happy that the rule came out the way it did.
Now, something you mentioned there too, they came out with the flights over people and the night flights, but also just included with that, it's not just flights over people, but it's over vehicles as well, right?
Yes, absolutely. And that was another big ask that we've been getting a lot of people interested in. And as you know, previous to the rule, there was just a straight up prohibition on operating over moving vehicles. I mean, you had to get a waiver to do that. You had to do all these different things. Now the rule permits it, albeit it's still rather limited. I mean, there are certain conditions and limitations in the rule. It's not just, hey, can I take my drone and hover it over I-94 and just sit there for 20 minutes filming traffic? I mean, there are still things in there that some people might find a little bit restrictive, but the rule itself, as you're pointing out, does now allow for certain types of operations over a moving vehicle without a waiver.
But it is progress, I guess. If there was a lot of ask for that, that's good that the FAA is at least considering that in some form.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something too that, especially with drones, when we look at Part 107, that will probably never be a static rule. And what I mean by that is, if you look at our airline rules, they're fairly static. They've been sort of that same way for years. Maybe they'll make a tweak here or there. But when you look at Part 107, we're making significant changes to that rule, and it's ongoing. So one of the things we'll probably talk about later is the latest Aviation Rulemaking Committee on Beyond Visual Line of Sight. So that's the next step in modifying Part 107 to normalize BVLOS operations.
Excellent. Excellent. So I noticed there's different UAV categories in this as well. You mentioned that there were certain criteria. And I wanted to touch on the one that I think most people are interested in, at least from what I hear. DJI came out with their mini series, which was the Sub 250. And that seems to be a real interesting niche of carve out for the UAVs. And of course, that is acknowledged in this regulation as well, that there's different categories, and that Sub 250 is one of those. So what I'm hearing is in that category 1, if there's no rotating parts that can lacerate human skin, then they're good to go. So as a practical matter, I hear a lot of people saying, I'm just going to grab my Mini, I'm going to throw on prop guards, and I'm going to be good to go. For instance, can I go to the beach and, run down the beach and just kind of fly over people? Or can I, as you mentioned, can I go above cars and kind of sit there for a period of time? Or can I only just transition? And, should be all legal doing that, is what I'm hearing from people. Prop guards were good to go.
Yeah. So, boy, there's a lot in that question. Let me see. Let me see if I can unpack it a little bit. So
Okay.
let me just try to go from simple to complex on this. See if I can walk us through it here. Absolutely correct on the different categories of drones. So when it comes to operations over people, the FAA has put into the rule that there'll be 4 categories of drones: 1, 2, 3, and 4. And quite honestly, the level of complexity of that drone operation rises with each level. I mean, there are certain criteria, weight and impact and things like that. But number 1, or category 1, will probably be the simplest to talk about. And as you pointed out, Keith, might apply to most people, or at least most people will try to fit into that box right away. So category 1 is interesting. I'm going to throw a term out here that you may have heard. If not, I'll explain it a little bit for your listeners. Performance-based rulemaking. All right, so the FAA has really, in the past few years, and this really isn't limited to drones, but just aviation and rulemaking as a whole, we've shifted away from prescriptive rulemaking. You could really even see that in the night portion of the new rule, where we say your lights have to be visible for 3 statute miles. We don't give you a minimum luminosity rating or some sort of other standard that it has to describe to operate and reliability and things like that. We just say it has to do this. We leave it to industry to figure out. Well, that's really how category 1 works as well. We're saying it has to be under 0.55 pounds or 0.55 pounds or under, right? They have to have something to ensure that the rotating parts don't lacerate people. How you do that is really up to the individual. So category one is I sometimes don't really like to use this term because it gives people the wrong idea, but it's a self-certification category. The operator themselves will purchase a drone. Does it weigh 0.55 pounds or less? Yes or no? Do I have any sort of protections on it that will prevent it from lacerating human skin? Yes or no? If you can answer both those questions, yeah, it meets the weight requirement. Yes, it's going to protect people. Then you've got a category one drone. There's no other FAA approval or authorization, so to speak, needed for that particular drone to operate over people. Now, I say that with the caveat because as we move into the little more complex portions of the role, there are certain things you still can't do. You know, sustained flight over people is going to require compliance with remote ID, Part 89. So while you may still have a category one drone, and yes, you can fly it over people, sustained flight over, I believe the term is open air assemblies of people, would require compliance with remote ID. So there still are some things you want to pay attention to before you just buy a drone, slap some prop guards on it, if you will, and start flying it over a whole bunch of people. You want to be aware of those caveats in the rule, that there are some additional restrictions, but for the most part, that category one is a self-certification piece. Do you meet the requirements the FAA put in the rule? Yes or no? Then you can go fly. Over moving vehicles is a little bit different. That's almost, you need to think of that as a separate part of the ops over people portion. Certainly, you're going to need to have a drone that meets category 1, 2, 3, or 4 for operations over people. But when you start talking about operating over moving vehicles, if you're going to be doing sustained flight over moving vehicles where you're just hovering over them, you're going to need to do that from a closed set. Think movie set or something, sure. Something that's closed off, is designated. You're not going to have surprises happening in there. For most people, when they think, well, I can just go fly over moving vehicles, you can, but you can't have sustained flight over them. You can't take your drone and hover it over a busy highway and be in compliance with the rule. You could certainly transit from one side to the other and maybe take your video as you're going across, if you will, but sustained flight would not be allowed. So when we're looking at operations either over people or over moving vehicles, it's very important that people understand the rules and the different types of limitations that are associated with them.
Excellent. That's very thorough. Thank you for unpacking that for me. I know I loaded a lot in there. Something you mentioned, I just want to kind of clarify. When we're talking about the over the moving vehicles, you did make a distinction between sustained flight over a moving vehicle or a transition, like if you're just going to fly over a highway and you're going to take video. When you were talking about the category 1 over people, you mentioned sustained flight would require remote ID. But is there a transition state to where you're transitioning from, across the beach? You're not sitting over a person. Is there something like that allows us to transition across over people and not have remote ID? Or is it any type of flight over is going to require the remote ID?
No, so that's a great question. Where remote ID is going to be required is the rule references it as sustained flight over open air assemblies of people. And we, of course, don't necessarily define in the regs what sustained flight is, nor do we define in the regs what an open air assembly of people might be. There are some good and some bad with not defining certain things, right? We can really leave it up to the individual. It does provide a little bit more flexibility, but unfortunately with that flexibility comes a little bit of confusion. So let me see if I could try to answer a little bit. My answers are really going to come from the final rule, which is, of course, a lengthy document. Yeah. That most people will probably never read. But in that rule, we do give some examples of what sustained flight might be. And the most obvious would be hovering. Hovering above an open air assembly over moving vehicles, or circling above them. You might even be able to argue transitioning, there's the word I'm trying to get to, across and back, across and back, across and back. Well, if 95% of your whole mission was over those people, somebody could argue, well, that it's a sustained flight over people. So I think it's important to understand that while there is flexibility and we don't necessarily define what sustained flight is, we do give some examples, and I just provided those that are in that rule itself. The open air assembly of people is another one just like sustained flight. What really is it? Well, I think we could all probably agree on the easy answer is a concert venue,
Right.
beach packed with people, anywhere where there's a large amount of people gathering. I think you could classify that as an open air assembly of people. But once again, we'll leave that up to the individual, and it's not there. We're not leaving it to the individual so we can play gotcha. We're leaving it up to the individual because you can make the determination best on the mission that you're flying. And so we really want to leave that flexibility into the system rather than, just like we do with performance-based rulemaking, rather than defining a hard set where it's trying to answer everyone, in which sometimes doesn't allow certain types of operation. We want that flexibility left in.
Okay, excellent. Good to know. When is the flight over people? Could I do it today? Or, what's the timing on that? And is there any criteria that are required first?
Yeah, so unlike the remote ID rule, the ops over people rule, you could comply with today for certain categories.
Okay.
For example, category 1, you could certainly have a drone and fly over people that meets a category 1 definitions and fly according to the rule, not a problem. If you wanted to do sustained flight over open air assemblies of people, you would need to have a drone that's remote ID, that's broadcasting remote ID, and we don't have those right now. So right now, that part of the rule, flying sustained flight over open air assemblies of people, you could not do because there's no way to comply with the remote ID rule and as of today. There are other categories in there. Categories 2 and 3 require what we call a means of compliance document and a declaration of compliance document. So those 2 categories of drones get a little bit more scientific, and we start talking about impact forces and impact energy and that type of stuff. So what the FAA needs to see is from a standards body in industry to come up with manufacturers or individuals could start saying, hey, I tested my drone according to that means of compliance. So I'm going to declare that it's in compliance with category 2 or 3. And that's when you get into a list of drones that are authorized called a declaration of compliance. So our declaration of compliance website, it's up and running. We're starting to get some interest to it. But what needs to happen for categories 2 and 3 will be that we need to have an FAA approved means of compliance and then a listing of drones that meet that requirement. And once we have that, now category 2 and 3 drones, which would be labeled obviously category 2 and category 3, would be able to go out and fly according to the rule.
Right. Okay. So it's really good you brought that up. I appreciate that. So if there's compliance that will be built in because the manufacturers, for instance, will certify a particular drone for a particular class, what does that mean for somebody who builds their own? I can think of the FPV community that builds a lot of them that probably are not going to meet the sub 250 with the batteries and the way they build them out. Is there any way for somebody to, we'll call it self-certify, or say, you know what, I tested it the best I could to the criteria that have been laid out, and I'm going to mark on there that it's a class 2, and I should be good to go with that. Is there anything like that that can be done with self-built, or some of the other drones that manufacturers even have that maybe are a little less expensive and they don't classify it? They just come out with something, maybe a toy drone or something. What do we do with those things?
Absolutely. So the whole means of compliance and declaration of compliance is open to the public. So that's individuals, it's home-built, I'll call you manufacturers, but home-built aircraft, as well as production aircraft from large UAS manufacturers. So what could happen is we would expect at some point, most likely this year, we'll start to get more and more means of compliance documents authorized. So there may be a variety to choose from. It may be 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe more of these means of compliance. So if you built something, an FPV drone in your basement and you're ready to go fly and you want to do ops over people, you could take a look at those means of compliance. And you can say, you know what, I'm going to test my drone in accordance with Alien Drone's means of compliance for a category 2 drone, because that's the one I want to meet. And then you go out and you do that test, and you submit to the FAA, I did the test according to that means of compliance. So I'm declaring that this drone is a category 2. The FAA looks at it and says, yes. And we will list that drone, your home-built drone, on our website, and it'll be a category 2 drone.
Oh, nice. Didn't realize you could do that. That's really good. And the criteria are available now, so somebody could go out, or are the criteria, you mentioned the website, or is the criteria still kind of evolving, or is that something that somebody could look up now?
Yeah, so the website's up and running, and what I'll try to get you the link here later so you could post
Okay.
it in the video. The website's up and running now. I believe we only have one means of compliance document, which is the one that the FAA sort of outlined in our advisory circular,
Yeah.
advisory circular 107-2A. But we do, again, expect to have a lot more available to choose from coming up in the future, so that you wouldn't have to be limited to just one. You could pick the one that you have the ability to test according to, and then have your drone meet that and then list it.
Okay, excellent. Something I also wanted to touch on, just because I know it will come up. This rule came out, whether it's the flights over people or the flights at night. This is for 107. This was part of the 107 rule, the changes that they made. So what does that mean for a recreational pilot? Can they do this at all, or do they have to be 107, or is it just completely unavailable to a hobbyist?
So this is a really simple question with a really nuanced answer. I'm so glad you asked, because it's something that I want to make sure everyone's aware of. So on the front end of it, we're only talking about Part 107. So everything we've talked about so far, operating over people, operating over moving vehicles, some of the sustained flight requirements tying into remote ID, that's all Part 107. A lot of people synonymously put Part 107 with commercial ops. And the reality is Part 107 is the civil UAS operating rule. So it encompasses everything. You can technically fly recreationally under Part 107. You just need to comply with all the Part 107 requirements. So you would need a remote pilot certificate. You'd have to have your drone individually registered, all the things that we normally associate with Part 107. I bring that up because if there are portions of Part 107 that work really, really well for somebody in an FPV community, they can choose to fly recreationally under Part 107 and take advantage of whatever allowances Part 107 is giving them, whether it's operating over people, moving vehicles at night, what have you. They can do that. When it comes to recreational flyers, which is a term that I specifically associate with Section 44809, which is the carve out. So think of it this way. Whenever you're going to go fly a drone, everybody has to fly under Part 107, unless you meet all the requirements of that very specific carve out that Congress made, called the exception for limited recreational UAS operations. And that's Section 44809. So under Section 44809, that carve out, so you're not flying under Part 107, it's a very different way of having a listing of rules, because it's almost rules within a rules. Now, in all fairness, the FAA did not write Section 44809. This was a congressional law, and we are adapting to it and adjusting to it. But there are about 8 or so rules under Section 44809 for recreational flyers. One of those rules says, and by the way, you need to follow safety guidelines of a community-based organization. So there's another set of rules. So the statute kind of goes through the below 400 feet and give way to manned aircraft, some of the big hitters, but then it also has that little one in there. Oh, and you also have to be following safety guidelines of an FAA recognized community-based organization. That's where it can get a little bit messy. So how does this all tie into recreational flyer? If you look at the statute for recreational flyers, you'll find nothing in there about flying at night, and you won't find anything in there about flying over people. However, you still need to be following those safety guidelines of a community-based organization. And more than likely, they will have requirements or restrictions for doing either one of those, over people, over moving vehicles, or at night. Now, I say all of this, and this is why I said it was a great question, but a lot of nuance to it. I say all of this when the FAA has not recognized any community-based organizations yet. We have an advisory circular out right now that sort of puts a Band-Aid on it and says, look, if you follow the safety guidelines of and I'm going to quote, existing aeromodeling organization today, you can meet the requirements of Section 44809. But it'd be interesting for your listeners to know that we also just put an advisory circular update to that out for public comment. Public comments are open until August 9th. And we encourage everyone to take a look at this updated advisory circular. So it's advisory circular 91-57C as in Charlie. And that is the advisory circular that will be the process for the FAA to finally officially recognize community-based organizations. So it's out for public comment right now. I invite everybody to go take a look at that and make your comment. But that will sort of put the last piece of the puzzle together for recreational flying. We did a huge piece just a little while ago with the recreational UAS safety test, or the trust that's required. We're going to put the final piece of that puzzle together, most likely late summer, early fall, where we'll start to recognize community-based organizations.
Excellent. That's perfect. It's interesting you mentioned about following the rules for the recreational pilot, and then under that pesky little number 2 in programming language, you call that nested. You come down to that, and it seems benign on the surface until you open up the CBO and go, holy, yeah. So it's an interesting thing that I think I did do a little video on that a little while ago, because that's exactly what happens is people just kind of, oh yeah, that's just a safety thing. But there is a lot of things that can happen. And since the FAA hasn't officially recognized CBOs at the moment, but it's coming, just like you mentioned with the advisory circular, there's going to be a lot more looking that they need to do at the CBO side to find out what's required as well, because it seems simple, but yeah, that darn nested thing will kind of catch you. So
yeah, and it's a good point to bring up, just because the way the FAA looks at it, again, I'll go back to my statement: everybody must fly under Part 107 unless you meet all the requirements, and that's the important phrase: all of the requirements. So from a legal perspective, if you're out there and you're a recreational flyer and you're flying under Section 44809, but you're not complying with all of the statutory requirements, for example, like you just brought up, not knowing that you have to follow the safety guidelines of a community-based organization or an existing air modeling organization, as we're calling them now, the FAA will be considering you to be operating under Part 107. So if you don't meet all the requirements, we consider you to be a Part 107 pilot, which means you need to have a remote pilot certificate, drone needs to be individually registered, so on and so forth. So that's right. It's important for people to understand that they really need to read that recreational flyer rule list and understand it completely.
Good point. Very good point. If you could kind of talk just briefly about the other categories, kind of what was the thought there of how those would fit?
The thought process behind that, and I really can't speak for the rulemaking team, but having read through the final rule, it really looks like they went back and looked at the operational records and the performance and the data they got back from those operating under back in the day when you needed waivers to fly over people with a waiver. And we took that data and said, okay, this seems to be working. So maybe we can't just make a blanket rule for all drones, but maybe if we break it down into different categories, that will allow people the flexibility they need to do the jobs or missions they need to do. So that's where we came up with the 1, 2, 3, and 4. We talked a lot about the category 1 for operating with people, but the category 2 and 3, you really get into impact energy. So we're talking about obviously drones that weigh more than 0.55 pounds, that are going to be larger drones, if you will, keeping in mind we're still talking Part 107. So no matter what you do, it has to weigh under 55 pounds. We're not talking massive predator type drones, but those sort of impact and kinetic energy studies that have been done, working with the data that we had, the rulemaking team with the engineers at the FAA came up with those different categories based on all of that. And then the means of compliance document, which we talk about, and then the declaration of compliance are the two ways, or it really makes a pathway for drone operators necessarily need to be a manufacturer of drone to have a category 2 or category 3 drone. When we get into category 4, that's almost an entirely different type of drone, a drone that's issued an airworthiness certificate, which is a pretty stringent requirement. It's not simply, I'm going to go test this in my backyard or test it down at the warehouse, and now I'm going to get this category 2 or category 3. We're talking FAA review engineers involving our aircraft operations people, aircraft engineers. There's a lot of work that goes into issuing an airworthiness certificate. If you want to think about it in terms of importance, we really only issue airworthiness certificates right now to aircraft that are manned aircraft, if you will, flying around. Okay. They have airworthiness certificates. Now we're talking about applying that same type of scrutiny to a drone. So category 1, relatively simple self-certification, if you will. Categories 2 and 3, a little bit more complex, but there will be pathways forward for people that want to fly category 2 or category 3 eligible. Category 4, probably going to be pretty limited, to either large manufacturers or large companies that want to go through the airworthiness certification process.
Okay, good to know. So it's kind of a side question that I was thinking about here as you were talking about the larger ones and different types of operations. Can you talk beyond visual line of sight just a little bit?
Yeah, so the remote ID, ops over people, night, all of that starts to lay the brickwork towards routine beyond visual line of sight. That's where industry wants to get to. Quite frankly, that's where we, the FAA, want to get to as part of our overall integration strategy. So all of this works towards normalizing beyond visual line of sight. It's typically, I've heard it referred to as the holy grail of FAA waivers because it's fairly difficult to get. I mean, you think about flying a drone and having it take off where you can't see it any longer. How does it know if another aircraft enters its area? How is it going to be controlled? What happens in an emergency there? So you're talking detect and avoid and sensing systems and potential radar issues. And so there's just a whole lot that works into that. Remote ID is really putting that first cornerstone in that advancement of beyond visual line of sight by starting to allow drones to have some sort of unmanned traffic management or UTM service, right? So there's a growth towards how we recognize it. So how are we going to enable beyond visual line of sight? And it's not just deliveries of packages that we're talking about here. It's not just for the multi-billion-dollar companies that we're trying to do this for. This is really for everyone involved. So how do we get this to work? Well, one of the first things we need to know is where are the drones out there? And remote ID is the first step towards that. I think if you took a look at the proposed rule, we had a lot of network requirements built in, requirement to connect to a cell tower and different things like that. That was universally argued against by the community with 53,000 plus comments. And the good news, the good news for the community is that we really did listen to you. It changed the rule. Those comments on remote ID, particularly the network connection capability requirement, that changed the final rule. I think everybody understands that now. If you look at the final rule, there is no network requirement in remote ID. It's gone, right? Could it come back in the future as a different, maybe lessons learned type requirement? Possibly, we don't know. But certainly that was our intention, was how are we going to figure out where all these drones are so that we can start having some sort of an unmanned traffic management system so they're not running into each other, they're not running into other aircraft. And remote ID is the first step in that process. So I know a lot of people aren't happy with remote ID. There's a lot of reasons why people are very concerned with remote ID, and we understand that. And we listen to you all the time. I get emails all the time. But it's certainly something that if we want to start normalizing beyond visual line of sight, we have to have something like remote ID to make it work. We need that safety, we need that security built into our airspace so that this becomes just something that's normal. Because right now, it's prohibited by rule unless you have a waiver. So I touched early on in our conversation, Keith, we just put together a beyond visual line of sight aviation rulemaking committee. And that's really the first step. It's the acknowledgement that the rule is probably going to change. And I'm talking about the Part 107 prohibition of beyond visual line of sight flying without a waiver. This aviation rulemaking committee is the first step in modifying that rule. It's what we did for remote ID. It's what we did for ops over people and night. So it's coming. And remote ID and the ops over people rule are there to enable it.
Okay, got it. Excellent. Thank you very much. Appreciate that info. From your perspective, is there anything that we should kind of know in addition to what we talked about today, or things that are important, or something you want to bring up?
Yeah, I think perhaps the biggest takeaway, at least for me, and especially we've talked a little bit about FPV flying, and I just want that the FPV community to know that we recognize you, right? It's not something that we're trying to leave you on the sideline or trying to somehow regulate you out of existence. We love the FPV community. There are just a lot of things that are happening, and the FPV community is a part of a larger community of drones. And that larger community involves everyone from the person that just bought the drone online and is flying in their backyard for fun, to somebody that's got a business doing photography or real estate, or somebody that's trying to do package delivery, search and rescue, or infrastructure inspection. It's all part of a broader community. So one of the struggles I think we have is a lot of times we view things from our community's perspective, in that when we look at things like, for example, remote ID, and it's like, why is the FAA trying to eliminate my hobby or get rid of my, we're not. As Keith, you and I talked about, it's not an attempt to slow you down. It's really an attempt to make sure we're stepping to allow future operations. We want to fly beyond visual line of sight. We want to be able to operate over people. We want the FPV community to continue and to grow. So although it might seem strange that the FAA is promoting and supporting FPV, while at the same time, in some people's eyes, putting out regulations that slow it down or hamper it, again, recognize that you're part of a broader community, and that we're all trying to move this community forward together to ensure future generations of drone pilots, because this is by far the most exciting segment of aviation. It's the fastest growing segment of aviation. We completely recognize that, and we're just doing our very best to support, while at the same time ensuring that continued level of safety that we've always enjoyed with our airspace system.
That's really nice. Appreciate the FAA is trying to acknowledge the FPV and make rules and things with them in mind, because I'm sure a lot of people are going to appreciate that for sure.
Absolutely. And if anybody in your viewership or your subscribers or anybody in the FPV, if they ever have any questions, they can always reach out to the FAA. One of the, I think the neatest things about the UAS side of the FAA is that we're very responsive to comments, to questions, to emails. You can email us at socialmedia@faa.gov, and we can either answer that question for you, or we can get it to anybody in the FAA that can answer that question for you. We also have a number of social media accounts that you don't have to follow all of them, but I would highly recommend that anybody that's flying drones follow at least our FAA Drone Zone Twitter and Facebook accounts, because we post everything newsworthy, latest and greatest safety tips. We also are engaging on those platforms. So those social media accounts and just our email accounts, just make sure you're engaged with the FAA. We're not a bunch of people in a dark basement somewhere trying to do things to wreck your fun. We're a bunch of people that really love this community. We love this segment of aviation, and we're doing everything we can to make sure that it stays that way. It's fun for people, and yet it remains really safe.
Excellent. Appreciate that. I really do appreciate you taking the time. I think we'll probably end it here. So I really do appreciate it, and look forward to having future discussions with you as well.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. This has been a lot of fun for me as well, Keith. Like I said, anytime that I get to talk to the real people, if you will, the real drone flyers out there doing the actual drone flying, it's always a treat for me. So it's been a great conversation. I appreciate you having me on.
Excellent. Well, certainly pleasure's all mine. I do appreciate it, Kevin. And again, I look forward to our next visit as well.
All right. Sounds good, Keith. Thanks.
All right. Thank you very much. So I hope you found this video of interest and maybe even learned something you didn't know before. I know I certainly did. And of course, I want your comments as well. This channel would not exist without you. So what did you think of the Flights Over People information? Did you like this type of interview style between Alien Drones and the FAA? Should I do more of this type of interview? Let me know your thoughts. Really appreciate it. And if you're not subscribed now, you might want to do that now, because when I have future content like this with the FAA, you'll be notified when that comes up. So thank you very much for viewing, and until next time, in the next video, good flying.